This is an emergency 11 Dubcast transmission. I'm George Eisner, joined by Chase Brown. It is October 12th. This is Sunday. We normally go to you. I was going to say live, but that's 11 Warriors live. We normally post these Monday morning. Chase Brown just got done doing 11 Warriors live. If you can't get enough of your Ohio State content today or your 11 Warriors breakdowns and analysis, and how could you? Because there's so much happening in the college football universe that we just had to go to you early Sunday evening to talk about it. So, Chase, thank you very much for joining me after you just got done doing 11 Warriors live. How are you doing this weekend?
Doing well. Certainly a busy weekend with all the things that were happening in the Big Ten this Saturday this week, with obviously Penn State's losing and Michigan losing at USC, and oh my gosh, Indiana beating Oregon on the road. It feels like Ohio State played a football game this weekend, but it's already far away from my brain considering all the other things that have happened, let alone what we're about to talk about, George. The
Yeah,
most
we are
important
we are
thing.
going to briefly recap the game, but obviously there were so many more different exciting things that happened in the Big Ten this weekend that we've definitely got to get into. Yeah, I've written 9 articles in the last 36 hours myself, so to reflect how much has been going on. So it's definitely been busy for me, but I appreciate you working this in. We are going to address the Frames Janklin sized elephant in the room, but before we do that, we want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor at 11 Warriors and the 11 Dubcast this season. That would be First Bank of Central Ohio. From game day to work day, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. Now, Chase, we did talk about Penn State when they had that truly historic, catastrophic loss to UCLA last week. And then I couldn't help end up mentioning it when I was talking to Kyle last week and the day after on the Dubcast. Of course, I ended up talking about it with Dan as we talked about the Big Ten power rankings, who, if you've ever questioned the sharpness or astuteness of Dan Hope, that man dropped Penn State to 18th in his Big Ten power rankings this week and got a lot of flack for it from 11 Warriors readers and the college football universe alike. And that guy was more ahead of the market than anybody.
He
But my
was.
point in bringing it up is I made the point of, all right, let's not beat this dead horse too much, because while it's very funny, the likelihood that Penn State bounces back is pretty high. They're playing Northwestern next weekend, and, maybe Northwestern beat UCLA and Penn State can't say that. So who's to say what's happened? But they're going to be at home. That's a get right spot. Surely there's no way that this team that had national championship expectations anointed onto it in the preseason would lose to the lowly Wildcats, would they? And then that's exactly what happened. 22-21. It's funny, I was getting done wrapping up the stuff that I had to write for the Illinois game while the Penn State and Northwestern game was winding down. And I remember getting a message from Dan, and he said, you might want to keep an eye on this game in case, Northwestern pulls this off. And I grew up in Chicago. Northwestern was the team that's the games that I would attend as a kid growing up. So I'm very familiar with how that football program, the ebb and flows of it. So I thought, they're not going to pull this off. It's nice to think it's one of those classic Pat Fitzgerald, Kirk Ferentz games where they make the affair a much sloppier contest than anybody anticipates, but they're not really. They're not going to have enough to get them to the end. And then they kick a field goal to take the lead 16-14. Penn State comes right down the field, scores a touchdown to take the lead back. Northwestern goes on a 12-play, 75-yard drive to answer right after that, take the lead back themselves. Penn State then gets the ball back. They are about to go 3 and out. They opt to go for it on 4th down. The play after Drew Aller gets injured and is later reported to be out for the season, adding quite literally injury to insult. I'm drawing a blank on the replacement quarterback's name for Penn State, who's presumably going to be the starter against Ohio State, but he is a Columbus native, comes in the game on 4th down, gets stopped short, and Northwestern runs the clock out from there. They gain, I think, 30 rushing yards on 5 plays to chew out the rest of the clock. And Happy Valley is covered in a chorus of boos, fire James Franklin. It was watching the videos coming out of that. It was a surreal scene seeing how incensed the fan base were. The culture around the players was everything. It was really toxic and bad. You made an interesting comment in our Slack about how you felt like this was a reflection of the fact that Penn State didn't really have a culture. And then I remember shortly after you said that, I saw several players on Penn State just kind of smiling in disbelief on the sidelines instead of really being upset about what had taken place. So I'm sure you've already expressed a lot of your opinions on the matter on the live, but I wonder if you can address that more in detail. What has led you to believe in that lack of culture that we've now seen James Franklin fired for the next day after this result? Because frankly, I think it was an astute observation, and you were absolutely correct.
Yeah. So the take I made was, Penn State followed a model this offseason that Ohio State and Michigan had perfected the previous 2 seasons. And that was bringing back players with experience who had championship aspirations. You hope that they can leverage those two things to have success. Um, and say what you want about Jim Harbaugh. I know that he's not the most popular person that's going to be talked about on our message boards and in our comment sections
He's the
and
most evil
among
man alive.
and you can think what you want about him, but there's also the other side of the coin with Jim Harbaugh is that the people who play for him love him. They would go to battle for him. They would gladly ride into battle with him and go to war with him. And I think when Michigan, when they came to that 2023 season, the players were motivated to play for him, to rally around him and that team. And I think the same is true of Ryan Day in 2024. Ohio State certainly had more moments with their back pressed against the wall than Michigan did this season earlier. But you think about the Oregon loss out at Autzen and Ohio State coming together after that loss, only for them to suffer the unthinkable loss to Michigan at the end of the year. And the way that Ohio State responded against Tennessee in the college football playoff, and then going on to beat Oregon in the Rose Bowl, beat Texas in the Cotton Bowl, beat Notre Dame in the national championship. I think you really have to appreciate what Ryan Day was able to accomplish with the Buckeyes last season, considering that that loss to Michigan could have really been the end, not only of Ohio State's season, they go to the playoff, they maybe lose to Tennessee, but it also could have been the end of Ryan Day's tenure as head coach here. But for that team to come together, to bounce back, to rally is not something that I saw from Penn State after their loss to Oregon. You see them go out west, travel to UCLA. They let one loss turn into two. You're thinking there's no way they're going to let two losses turn into three. They'll bounce back against Northwestern. But what ends up happening is that they suffer an upset to a team that has not, in my lifetime, ever been a serious Big Ten contender. Like they've made the national, or excuse me, they made the Big Ten championship game a few times. But as you're mentioning, George, like you grew up watching Northwestern, they aren't in among the elite. And you certainly would never expect Northwestern to go to Beaver Stadium and get a win over Penn State. And so all of those things transpired. We now sit here. James Franklin has been fired. Drew Aller is out for the season. I don't know what you would expect from this team for the rest of the year, George, but we were talking about it on the live show. Like, there's a chance that this team doesn't win another game this season. If they do, maybe they end up at 5-7. Their best case scenario, though, is 7-5. I think they're not going to beat Ohio State. They're not going to beat Indiana. Maybe they find a way to go win at Kinnick next week. Maybe they find a way to win the other three Big Ten games on their schedule besides Iowa, Ohio State, and Indiana. But it just doesn't seem like this team has the culture, nor do they maybe now have the guys to make something out of this season. And it's just it's shocking when you consider the national championship expectations they had coming into the year.
Well, I think in trying to avoid as much as entertaining as it would be to see them lose out, obviously, because that also means that Ohio State presumably beats them very badly. I think at this point you have to imagine Ohio State's in a good shape to beat them regardless of what happens. But in defense of them, we have just seen in an example of one team that just beat Penn State, what can happen when the guy at the top is removed from the ecosystem and how quickly things can recover and the mood around a program can change if a lot of the talent is still in place. That's reflected in UCLA. It what I said last week after Penn State lost to UCLA was if there's one person not attached to Penn State that looks worse out of this result right now than anybody, it's Deshaun Foster, because the potential for UCLA to be this good must have always been there, and they weren't reaching anywhere close to that when he was in charge. UCLA had an impressive showing against Michigan State again this past weekend, and now suddenly UCLA is a team that Ohio State has to play in November, and you wonder what that game is going to look like. If it is, I don't want to necessarily say a trap game. It is a revenge spot for Nico Iamaliava, but you one like the potential reward for Ohio State winning that game is not as much as the risk given the national profile that UCLA has, but they're playing much better right now, having taken the source of the issue out of the equation. You wonder if something is possible here like that for Penn State too. I don't think I think a losing record is probably pretty likely. At the same time, I would, especially because they have a rough stretch coming up, as you alluded to. They got to play at Iowa next week, who just shut out Wisconsin in Wisconsin's own house, and then they got to play Indiana, who looks like there are a lot of people were making the argument that Indiana should jump Ohio State for number one going into the polls this coming week 8. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but you certainly can't bat your eyes if you're an Ohio State fan at what Indiana has done in their body of work this season. It's undeniably impressive, far more impressive than what they accomplished last season prior to playing Ohio State. And then they got to play Ohio State. There is a very realistic scenario in which Penn State loses their next 3 games. I'm not entirely up to speed on what their November schedule is, but I would think that there's a situation where they can probably at least carve out a couple wins, but the wheels could come off if they are going on a 3-game losing streak coming into this stretch. So it is going to be interesting to see what happens at Iowa, because that's certainly on paper the most winnable game that they have out of their next 3.
Yeah, they
One
have
one
Iowa. I'll just give you their schedule real quick, just to to really look at. I'm looking at it now actually for the first time because I didn't go look at it during our live stream. But they play at Iowa, and then they have a bye week, and then they play at Ohio State. They host Indiana, then they go to Michigan State on November 15th. They host number 25, currently number 25, Nebraska on November 22nd, and then they'll end their season November 29th at Rutgers. So you would think that they would at least be able to come up with a couple of wins there, but that's actually a pretty tough schedule. Like, of those games currently, I would say the most likely for them to win are Michigan State and Rutgers.
I agree.
But I also would have said with Drew Aller and with James Franklin as your coach that you would have beaten Northwestern at home. So now I feel like all bets are off with this team. I think it's kind of like, I do think you make a really good point about what potentially someone at the helm that's different than James Franklin could inject into this team. I'm curious to see if they do have a little bit more energy this week coming out and playing Iowa. But yeah, I'm definitely looking at that schedule and not seeing a great likelihood for them to get more than 2 wins. And it would be crazy for the team that came in with national championship expectations to not even qualify for a bowl game at the end of the year. That would be something. I don't know if too many teams have ever had quite that trajectory throughout college football's history.
Yeah, it's certainly one of the most. I mean, one of the talking points that I loved echoing coming into the season was when ESPN, who as much as we love to criticize the worldwide leader in the ongoing war between the SEC and the Big Ten, and obviously the camp that ESPN more sympathizes with, ESPN ran an article very shortly before the season in terms of sorting teams that kind of were in prove-it mode into different tiers. And the one team that they put the championship or bust label on was Penn State. And I had no problem saying, let's put those expectations on James Franklin and see what happens. You're going to put the championship or bust label on a coach whose whole brand is losing to top 10 opponents. I would love to see how that pans out. And it couldn't have panned out in sillier fashion. He has now been removed barely midway through the college football season. I don't know how many people could have guessed something like that would happen. I think if you wanted to say that they were going to lose to Ohio State and potentially lose to Indiana and lose to Oregon and maybe have 3 losses by mid-November, that's probably a realistic forecast for them coming into the season. And then people would still be making the point of James Franklin can't win the big one, but it's not like he's outright fired yet. You losing those 3 games but still having Penn State in a position to get a winning record, you don't pay a $50 million plus buyout for that if you're the
Right.
Penn State administration. But the way things have unfolded, I don't know if anybody could have seen this coming. They're the first team to lose as 20-point or more favorites in back-to-back games in the last 30 years. That is, it is truly unprecedented incompetence that we have seen from Penn State the last 2 weeks. And it is, in fact, so incompetent that we felt so obliged to do a Sunday version of the 11 Dubcast. So I think, again, I keep invoking the dancing on the grave. Flogging a dead horse, what have you. I think it, as much as I would like to keep doing that, it's probably going to be something that we continue to talk about over the course of the week. And if you want more thoughts on it, I'm sure you guys talked about it at length on 11 Warriors Live, and I would recommend to anybody listening that you go and tune in for that as well. Not just after the fact, but also when it's happening, usually at noon on Sundays following Ohio State game days later in the season. Make sure you're subscribed to the 11 Warriors YouTube channel for that. Let's quickly recap the Ohio State Illinois game, which I have to say was far less exciting than this news about James Franklin and was probably my least favorite of the games that have happened so far this season. And that includes the Grambling State game. Now, it was another game in which they mostly were able to just lean on the luxury of the defense. Couple early turnovers from Illinois. They get us like a 20-3 lead. The spread in the game was like 14.5 points. They end up covering that, but they were much further out in front of that in the early stage of the game to where you don't want to say it was non-competitive, but I felt completely unthreatened for Ohio State in this game, which is definitely a luxury if you're cheering for a team that is facing a fellow top 25 opponent, to say that you were relatively unthreatened playing a game in their own house. One thing I did think was interesting, because one of the articles that I wrote over the weekend was I covered Brett Bielema's post-game press conference, and I got, most of the time you're just sifting through a lot of coach speak and you're trying to draw water out of a stone. Look no further than the last one I did, when I believe the name of Ohio's coach was Brian Smith, and he largely didn't even acknowledge Ohio State relative to his own team. Very dry. But Brett Bielema is obviously a character. You hope he's going to say something interesting. He was mostly very cordial towards Ohio State, called Ryan Day an exceptional coach, talked about how he's optimistic about what they're going to do in terms of heightening the Big Ten's brand, or continuing to do that, not only coming off the national championship, but what they can do later in this postseason. But I thought it was very interesting that he made the point that he felt like that Illinois didn't go to tempo earlier enough in this game, and went out of his way to say that they couldn't do shit, Ohio State's defense, that is, when they did go to that. Because I heard that, and I'm sure as a senior producer at 11 Warriors, you know as much as I do that, oh man, the readers they're going to just have a field day with that one. They're going to go off on poor Bert. But what was so interesting to me was reading the comments for that story. There were so many people that it's like that. I think it's a meme from one of those Marvel movies where the guy on the plane says he's out of line, but he's right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what a lot of the sentiment was towards Brett. He's like, yeah, he's kind of a douche, but it's not like he's wrong. They did struggle when Illinois went up tempo. I expected all vitriol towards Bert, and most of it was just an acknowledgement that Yeah, he was kind of actually correct. So, my question for you is coming out of that game, given the success Illinois did have in the later stages of the game when they did kind of try to speed things up with Luke Altmaier and the defense and the offense against Matt Patricia's defense, how concerned are you about other teams recognizing what worked in this game for Illinois, albeit not necessarily in a competitive situation, and implementing that into how teams attack Ohio State going forward?
Yeah, so this was something I asked Andy about on 11 Warriors live show earlier because for me, and I feel like this is coach speak, so I apologize. I have to go back and watch the game again to just kind of see when was Illinois the most successful in their up tempo situations. Because to me, it felt like they found most of their success late in the game when it was already decided that Ohio State was going to win. And it was interesting to me knowing that the way Ryan Day talked about his team's performance once the game was over, he had said he thought Ohio State played with great energy, particularly for the first 3.5 quarters, is how I would take what he said. He said they took their foot off the gas at the end of the game. And so I'm trying to really figure out, okay, does Ohio State have an issue against up-tempo offense? Or was it just that Ohio State knew that the game was in hand? They kind of take their foot off the gas. They lose a little bit of mental focus. They're not getting their feet set and the play calls in and everyone's not in the right spots. And Illinois was able to take advantage of that. So I have to figure out exactly which of those two things is true. Maybe it's a little bit of both. And I do think that it's good for Ohio State to maybe get some of these looks in a game that was already decided against a team that can throw the football very efficiently. Because coming into this game, Luke Altmaier was a quarterback that had thrown 12 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Ohio State forced the first pick that he had thrown this season, and they obviously forced 2 more turnovers in addition to that. So the defense by no means played poorly in this game. And I do think that if Illinois would have caught them earlier with some of that up-tempo stuff, I trust that over the entirety of the 6 games that we've seen Ohio State's defense perform and what we know to be true about Matt Patricia, that they would have been able to make the correct adjustments to figure out a way to win and to keep that Illini offense at bay. But I do think that it could be just maybe a little bit of both. Ohio State took their foot off the gas a little bit toward the end of the game, but maybe they do have some stuff to work on in terms of getting set quicker and understanding their assignments when an offense is going to be pushing the tempo like that.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that mildly concerns me about this is that if Ohio State ends up making the Big Ten championship, I would imagine that that's probably the first time they're going to play a quarterback that can consistently capitalize on exploiting that if it really is an issue with that kind of style of play. They're not going to have to play Drew Aller anymore. Bryce Underwood, as talented as he is, has shown a lot of inconsistency with his accuracy that I think would not benefit playing in an up tempo style. So even though I think he could give Ohio State some problems just on the sheer talent that he has demonstrated, you saw against USC last night how that inconsistency with his accuracy is still going to be an issue that is plaguing Michigan for in their offense for the rest of the season, particularly if Justice Haynes isn't available for whatever reason to kind of spell him a little bit on the ground. Nico Iamaleava might be the best quarterback remaining that Ohio State faces during this regular season.
George, can I share something that Dan said earlier?
Sure.
Dan said UCLA might be the best team that Ohio State faces until they face Michigan.
I
Would
don't
you
think that's a
believe?
far-fetched statement.
Would you believe the UCLA team that was 0-4 a couple of weeks ago? That's okay. That's not me saying that. That's not Andy saying that. That's Dan freaking Hope saying that
Yeah.
UCLA might be the best team. He's thought about that. If he's going to say that live on air in something that somebody could record it, tape it, post it on social media, Dan Hope has thought about that take. And he thinks that UCLA might be the best team that Ohio State faces before the Michigan game. That
Yeah.
shocked me. But honestly, the more I thought about it, the more he might be onto something there.
I don't think it's a ridiculous statement. I mean, we did an entire show in September where we were lambasting UCLA for being bottom of the barrel after they lost to New Mexico 35-10 at home. And again, it's like the point I made earlier with, taking the head coach that has seemingly held the program back out of the equation. You see how quickly things have turned around for UCLA on the sheer merit of doing that alone, and it's possible something similar can happen for Penn State, where you galvanize the program when you're in a situation where you were at your lowest point, and the new guy that comes in is bringing an attitude of nobody believes us anyway, so there's nowhere to go but up. Dan Hope and I didn't believe in them right after they fired Deshaun Foster, and look what they've done now. And now it shows you how quickly things can turn around, not just in a month, but in a handful of weeks. So I don't think it's a ridiculous statement at all. I and Nico Iamaleava, like I said, it's going to be a revenge spot for them. I think that he's probably the most talented quarterback that they're going to face, other than Bryce Underwood, in for the remainder of the season. And so if UCLA is playing the same kind of aggressive offense that they did that gave them the upset against Penn State, that Illinois had moments of success with against Ohio State this past weekend, I don't think it's crazy that he could have a good performance against them. And that being said, a lot of players on this defense that have stuck around from last year that are familiar with how to give Nico Iamaleava problems. So I would trust that they're going to have the experience to still come out and do well and do what needs to be done to win that game, but one game at a time. We gotta go to Camp Randall this next weekend and hunt some badgers. And granted, they just got shut out there by a far less offensively talented Iowa team that put up 37 points on them this past weekend. But who knows? It's a revenge spot for Luke Fickell, a reunion of sorts. Perhaps he will have his guys ready to go. The spread of 28.5 points would indicate otherwise, which is the largest spread between these two teams since 1999, and the second largest spread that Ohio State has had this season, tying with the Ohio game. So the fact that Wisconsin is now being graded among the MAC non-conference opponents that Ohio State has had kind of speaks to where that program has fallen as well. I was a little worried that Luke Fickell was going to get let go today. I'm kind of surprised James Franklin got let go before Luke Fickell did, but for the sake of Ohio State as an overall brand, I'm grateful that Fickell seems to have at least a little bit more confidence from the Wisconsin administration than any good faith Penn State may have still had in mind for James Franklin. So thank you for tuning in to this emergency transmission of the 11 Dubcast. Chase, thank you for joining me on this Sunday afternoon to make this happen. We will be back tomorrow, or not tomorrow. Well, it's going up Sunday, so we'll be back Tuesday morning to preview this week's film study with Kyle Jones. Make sure you like and share this video and subscribe to the 11 Warriors YouTube channel so you get that when it drops, and so you get all the wonderful 11 Warriors lives when they go live, featuring the great personalities at 11 Warriors, such as Chase Brown. Chase, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, and we will be back on Tuesday morning with another episode of the Dubcast. Take care, folks.